talk about Florence Price's The Goblin and the Mosquito. I'm going to show how to teach the piece and why it is a great teaching piece. This is a short, fun character piece for early intermediate to intermediate students. It is a great teaching piece because the title, the form, and the motives in the song inspire imagery based on the title, The Goblin and the Mosquito. It also sounds a little bit harder than it actually is, which we always like and students always like, and it has several moments for artistic expression. It's a perfect recital piece on its own for a younger, less experienced student, or as a companion piece to a slower and more mechanical one that an older student is playing. This is around OMTA level 5, so at this point, students have probably started some Baroque repertoire like inventions and minuets, and that is really good for this piece because it uses different articulations in each hand. So 2 specific sections in measure 5 when you have in the left hand staccato and the right hand legato, and then at the end of the song. So some knowledge of Baroque repertoire and grace notes, because there's grace notes in this song, is really helpful. Additionally, it's a fast song, so it would be good if this is in conjunction with some classical sonatinas for agility. This could be their first character piece outside of a method book, or it could be after some of the easier ones, like Schumann's The Wild Horseman or Soldier's March, or some of the easier Bergmüller etudes. If it is their first character piece, it might be the first one that they experience with extreme dynamic and character contrasts, and where they have to quickly move around the piano. But I have found that these pieces are really well prepared for by method books, which is why I keep my students in method books a lot longer than some other teachers. Often when a student learns a new concept in a method book, even up to the higher levels, they're given a character piece that corresponds to that new idea. So, I mean, this is going back to an earlier level, but when they learn staccato, they play a song called Jumping Beans. So the same goes for this piece, The Goblin and the Mosquito. You can use some elements of this piece, like the rapidly changing characters and the grace notes, to teach them in the context of a story. So if students have been in method books to this point, they're probably pretty well prepared for this, and that's why I keep them in those for a long time, because they are more prepared for all styles of music. And often if students are taken out of method books too early, they rush into repertoire, inventions, and sonatinas, and they sometimes are not even enjoying the music that they're playing and they get bored. But this is obviously not a boring piece. It's super, super fun. And it's also a 20th century piece. You could have also had them play some Bartók or Kabalevsky before this. Additionally, Florence Price does have 3 sketches for little pianists that could be played before this one, their elementary level. I really like introducing those 3 sketches and this piece to my young girl students because their faces light up when they hear they're playing a song written by a female composer. Of course, every student should be playing music by and learning about marginalized composers, and this piece just is a really good one to start with. If they really like this piece, Florence Price also has 7 descriptive pieces that are a little more difficult than this one, and that could be a fun next step. At the age that a student is learning this piece, at around 9 to 12, it's the perfect time to explore 2 important things. So first, the idea of narrative. So students are not too old to have fun with the imagery of this piece and to create a narrative. I find that when students are teenagers, they often kind of think they're too old for those kind of things. Obviously they're not, and they usually come back to it, which is great. And I obviously just have fun with this piece, creating the narrative and the different characters. But they're not too old for that. And they're also not too young to begin learning about the music of marginalized composers and the history of their lives, like Florence Price. Whenever I introduce a piece by a composer that the student doesn't know, I often like to give some biographical information. Not too long, unless the student's really interested, and then you can send them home with some reading materials. But I would definitely talk about how Florence Price was the first African-American woman composer to have a composition played by a major American orchestra. A crazy thing. Depending on how old the student is, you can add more to her story. So I would definitely talk about how her race and her gender caused her to be marginalized, and that a lot of her music wasn't even discovered until recently because of those things. that held her back. And you can talk about how those things happen in society and why it's important to play music by marginalized composers. You can also go into some history at the time if the student is a little bit older. So Florence Price had a mom who was mixed who kind of passed as white and a father who was black. And when she went to the New England Conservatory, her mom told her to pass as Mexican, which kind of shows you what the situation was like during that time. Additionally, she had even more discrimination that she faced after college because that's when Jim Crow laws started to set in, segregation, and then many African American residents of the South moved north through the Great Migration. So this is a great opportunity to just talk about a composer, and if they find her story really interesting, you can point them to some literature. So let's get into the piece and how to teach it. So there is a lot on the page. It is not a good sight reading piece. I would not put this in front of a student and be like, let's go. I would first demonstrate. And before demonstrating, I would talk about the title and ask the student to think about what they're noticing, what the imagery they're picturing when you play, where they think the Goblin is coming in, where the Mosquito is coming in, because that'll help them for when they get ready to play it. Then when they are ready to play, this piece is a piece that definitely needs to be chunked into sections because of the differing characters. You go from a section that is loud and exuberant to a section like this, to a section like this, and that's just within 8 measures. So you need to chunk into the different characters, and it's like 4 to 8 measures when a different kind of articulation or dynamic shows up. I would definitely add dynamics and articulations the first time around. I would not ignore them because that is what's defining these sections and making them important. Also, I would do hands together to start off because it's really a dialogue, and you can't play a section like this hand separate. That's just not a good idea to do. So I would chunk the sections and have them learn each section. I wouldn't wait too long to combine sections because you want to practice those transitions. It's not a good idea to stay in those chunks for too long just because then they'll only practice those 4 measures, take a break, and then go on to the next 4 measures and not really get the transition in. So like I said, you should probably do hands together right from the get-go. Most of these parts I would just learn as is with everything, and that will help them so that they're not trying to add in dynamics and articulations when they've learned the whole piece. So getting into the technical aspects of this piece, we've talked about kind of the overall structure and how I would teach it, but let's get into some of the nitty-gritty. So I would definitely have the student practice while they are working on this piece, the C major and A harmonic minor scales, and also the chromatic scale with a bunch of different articulations, speeds, and dynamics. This will help with all the different parts of the piece. So when you're warming up for the piece, you could tell your student to play the C major scale with legato on the way up and staccato on the way down, or the opposite, but with both hands, something like that. That will really help with this piece. Also, there are grace notes in this piece, and if the student has started Baroque repertoire, they're not like the grace notes that they've seen because the big note is always on the beat, even though there's not a slash through it. The big note is going to be on the beat. So when I go through these sections first, I would practice maybe only once without the grace notes, and then I would add them in. So for example, in the C major section at the end of the piece, you have this. And I'm playing it a little bit slower. So I would have a student just maybe once play it like this to figure out where the notes fit in. And then they would realize that they can't just play because it's not going to fit in the beats. They have to figure out where those notes fit in. They have to play to fit in the notes. And all of those sections with the grace notes, I practice individually because they're all different. Some of them you have to end on a staccato note, some of them you don't end on a staccato note. Some of them use both hands, like in that section. One particular section that is probably the most difficult is right at the beginning of the piece, where you have this. And that's because the highest note that you're playing with the pinky has to be the loudest. It has a short sawno on it. So you want to start off slow and soft. And a staccato at the end. I practice that flick of the wrist. For all of these grace notes, you have to flick the wrist. You have to understand the choreography of it all, especially with the story and the narrative of the piece. So this section, it's going to be tricky, and you might have to work on some pinky strengthening exercises so that it can be louder than the other notes. But I think it sounds really cool because if you play it like this, you don't really hear that melody note at the top. But if you start off soft and then get to the loudest point at the ending note, it sounds like that E is really a part of the melody and the biggest part. And that comes into play in a couple other sections too. The next thing is all the quick changes. So like I talked about earlier, you want to not just chunk, but you want to practice transitions. So there's lots of transitions with dynamics, articulation, and then also the geography, moving around the piano. So I would drill between all of those sections. The other thing is the expression, because that's obviously kind of the most important thing, because this is the character piece, the choreography of it all. I would play the piece for the student or part of it without dynamics to show them kind of how boring it is. Like at the beginning of the piece, I'll play measures 3, 4, and 5. And this is without dynamics. Also without articulations, but you get the point. And then with, and they'll notice so much of a difference. So just these little things that make the piece super big, and they're not even little things. This is a character piece. So the dynamics, the articulation, all of those things are just so integral to the narrative of the piece. And a student really, really has to get that. And maybe at this point through the repertoire they learned, they haven't actually got that. And this is a great piece for them to really just like think about that. Think about the narrative. It's not too hard of a piece once you learn it. So really having an imagination and trying to evoke different parts of the narrative. So 2 more things. Other parts of expression include things like ritordandos. This piece doesn't have any written in, but there are a couple good places where you could put them in. So in measure 19 and 20, when you're going back into the main Goblin theme, there you can add a ritardando. Just a little one, and it helps bring it into the next section. And then at the end of the piece, you can add a ritardando. I don't really add one until like the last couple notes, where if I'm going at this speed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, then I might at the end go 2, 3, 4. So I might just take a little bit longer for those notes. It depends on what the student thinks, because there's nothing written in, but it's fun to give the student some agency in those things. And then lastly, pedal. So there's no pedal written in, but there are a couple spots where you could use it, and depending on where your student is at with their skills with the pedal, you can ask them areas that they think it would be good. There's a lot of staccato in this piece, so you have to be really, really brief with the pedal. At the beginning of the piece though, you can use it whenever this motive comes in. Just for the first fifth, because there's a tenuto marking that goes into a staccato, so you don't want it down for the staccato. There's maybe not a huge difference, but there's some more resonance, and if the student likes that, that's a good place to add it. Another good place is in measure 15. It starts off with a staccato in that measure, but then is legato, and you could add pedal there. So without pedal, and then with pedal. So that could be a good spot to add it. And then at the end of the piece, you almost need pedal. So 41 to 44, I'm gonna play without pedal. and then with pedal. So during this section, it sounds so much better with pedal, and your student will probably realize that too, and that's a good place to add it. Other than that, there's not really any other places. So I would kind of work with the student on a lot of these things that have to do with choreography and expression. Make sure that they're exaggerating, because this is a character piece that is kind of like sarcastic, kind of funny, kind of humorous, and they can express all these different aspects through exaggerations, through theatrics. So that's how I would teach this piece. Overall, the chunking at the beginning is super important because there are vastly different shifts between sections. And then I would make sure that you quickly move into chunks that straddle those sections, and then work on kind of the two main technical difficulties that are in this piece, which are the grace notes and then the expression and choreography of the piece. So I'm excited to keep teaching this piece and to teach it more often because I think it's an amazing piece. I think every student loves it, and it can teach your student a lot through the narrative of the piece and also through just how fun it is to play. Students love to practice things that are fun, and they can show off with it at a concert. I'm so glad that Florence Price's music has gotten some of the credit that it deserves, and I really hope that teachers continue to bring these pieces into their studios and show students Florence Price's music, and that orchestras continue to program her music.